morning, everybody. Welcome to this session on the role of data science in climate change mitigation. My name is John Rowe. I'm the Programme Director at the Alan Turing Institute for the Data Science for Science and Humanities programme. In that programme, we cover the application of AI techniques and data science methods in lots of different areas of research. Yesterday, if you were with us, you'd have seen some fascinating talks on the role of AI in areas like astronomy and in materials science, for example. And one of the most important kind of subfields that we work in is in environmental science and climate change. Obviously a huge challenge facing society at the moment, and we believe that AI and data science has got a critical role in helping us confront those challenges. This is because, as with lots of fields, there's just more and more data becoming available, and we need new methods to be able to handle that. And in particular, there's lots of different modalities and resolutions from different kinds of sensors that are out there in the world, from satellites that are observing the Earth to sensors that are based on ships or on robots that are going around the ocean. And so there's a need for methods to mine all this data and bring together the data from lots of different domains. At the Turing, we've got a whole bunch of different projects working with environmental scientists. We're working with some of the NERC funded labs like British Antarctic Survey, where we're using satellite observation to track icebergs, or we can forecast where the Arctic Sea is going to freeze each year, month by month. We've got work on monitoring air pollution in major cities such as London. Work with the Met Office. We've recently signed a partnership agreement with the Met Office, and we're developing new tools with them. And we've just started a couple of big projects. One looking at this issue of environmental sensors, how you can combine data from different modalities like satellites and ground observation to lead towards what's called a digital twin of the environment. And we're going to be hearing more about digital twinning later. The other project is more about combining different kinds of data sets to solve challenging problems. And this is looking at the impact of climate change on different aspects of agriculture. And this, as you can imagine, involves bringing together data from lots of different areas, from meteorology and plant science, soil science, hydrology, and so forth. So these are really fascinating projects. I'm hoping and believe that we can prove that data science, while it won't be a magic bullet, of course, to solve our environmental problems, it will do an awful lot to help us bring together all the relevant resources that we need in order to start addressing some of the climate change challenges that we face. So this morning, we've got two speakers who are going to talk about two different kind of related projects. First of all, we'll hear from Sabina Leonelli, who's a Turing Fellow and also at the University of Exeter. And she's going to be discussing this problem of how we can combine lots of different kinds of data in order to address climate change problems. And that'll be followed by a talk by Ruchi Chowdhury, also from the Alan Turing Institute, who's going to be looking at a particular kind of digital twinning project. So I'm really looking forward to these two talks. There'll be a chance for question and answers at the end. Please do put in your questions into Slido. If you see a question that you like on Slido, please do vote for it, and then we can pull out kind of the most popular questions. But we'll have the two talks first, and then there'll be time for the question and answers afterwards. So on that note, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Sabina Leonelli. Over to you, Sabina.
Thank you very much, John, and delighted to be here, of course. I will indeed be talking about the kinds of data that we're using, particularly for climate mitigation in agriculture. And I'm going to be reflecting on the challenges and the opportunities that try and bring together such a complex data landscape actually present. So the first thing to point out is that a lot of the work that we're doing at the Turing is centered on this idea of environmental intelligence. So the application of AI onto environmental challenges. And that has a strong codependence with having access to reliable, machine-readable, high-quality reference data. And not only the data, but also information about data, the so-called metadata. And very often when it comes to environmental issues, we also want to have access to the materials that relate to the data, like specimens or samples, and of course, to the relevant kinds of domain-specific knowledge. So one can say generally, and I think this is something that's been pointed out in other talks in AIUK already, the conditions for trustworthy data sharing and integration in this field are really important, and they're determined by a variety of factors, which include technology and related standards. So both the software and the hardware, but also the infrastructures, the standards, the ontologies, the metadata standards that are used in the field, depend on skills, both in terms of what the data scientists need to be able to do in order to intersect with domain experts in these areas, and vice versa, the questions around how do we train domain experts to be able to adopt data science perspectives and strategies, and indeed make data ready for employment in environmental intelligence. There are obviously very big policy and governance issues. So, for instance, the question around how does one define, and of course, how does one monitor the lawful use of data in this field. And there are serious questions around ethics and accountability. Often these questions are put aside when it comes to environmental intelligence and climate change, with the idea that actually these are questions that are mostly present in biomedicine in relation to personal health-related data. But in fact, there are very big challenges also in this domain in terms of how does one acknowledge and reward the provenance of data? How does one allocate responsibility for decisions taken during data processing and data use, and of course specifically with mistakes and concerns that may arise from there, and how does one identify gaps in the data and exclusions that may happen from data streams and data collections, and their implications, of course. So my focus here is on the green sciences, agricultural, environmental, and climate science. One of the very important characteristics of these domains is that we are looking at very different cultures of data exchange. We're looking at people who are based within labs, people who are based in hybrid spaces like experimental stations, and people who are based in field trials and in kind of outside workspaces. We're also looking at a domain that embraces researchers working in basic research all the way to researchers working in very applied fields. And we're looking at a domain which is rich with public and private intersections, and in fact, particularly in the agro sector, vastly dominated by private enterprise. And that means also is not a domain that's restricted to academic work, but is very much also going beyond that. And within that, there is a variety of widely different methods and very heterogeneous methods that are combining to create this data. So in this landscape, linking the data with each other to create something like a coherent and reusable whole is an enormous challenge. And it needs intelligent openness. It needs strategies for really thinking through how do we share the data, under which conditions, and how can we do that so that we actually can develop relatively quickly coping strategies for how quickly our planet is changing and reacting to that. Specifically, I want to talk about some of the results we're having on a project which are now based at the Alan Turing Institute, called From Field Data to Global Indicators. This is a project that's already been going on for a couple of years and includes collaborations with the FAO, the United Nations, and various other organizations that are particularly focused on how to share and reuse data coming relating to the agricultural field and coming also from plant sciences. So in this field specifically, there's many things that are high relevance to the question of climate mitigation. One of the things that data science can do here is to try and find predictors for the health of the soil and for how crops will perform, particularly under changing environmental and climatic conditions. We can monitor the spread of crop pests, which are now moving very differently because partly of climate change and partly because of the ways in which humans move around the world. We can have faster manners of detecting disease. We can evaluate what is stressful to plants and crops and how that can affect the whole chain of food security and food production. We can study diversity in the environment and what kind of new or underexploited crops are there that can actually be adopted and used better for survival in different climates and in different regions of the world. We can, of course, use the power of genomics to identify viable biomarkers and to input a better understanding of how plants grow and which varieties can develop best in the world. We can estimate photosynthetic capacity, how plants react to sunlight and different conditions, and of course understand and foster precision agriculture in a broader sense by integrating plant data with environmental and even health data. Now, again, this poses very interesting challenges. We have a situation where not only the data sources are very heterogeneous, but in fact, we have a mix of quantitative data, observational data coming, for instance, from field trials, and imaging data coming, for instance, from environmental sensors. And this is all trying to understand a very complex systems at multiple scales of organization, going from the genetic scale of organism organization all the way to the ecosystem scale. What does that mean? It means, first of all, that we need a common standards for how we describe what we see in the world, how we describe plant traits specifically, which is a complex endeavor because there are many factors relevant to try and understand what counts as an important trait of a plant, which include commercial factors as well as biological factors. And we also need to find the appropriate metadata that can inform an appropriate contextualization of the analysis of the data that we produce. And this means trying to breach the different cultures of data exchange, which I've already mentioned, which are going through scales, national borders, and private domains. And this, in turn, means that we need to put a lot of attention on sharing and access and even reuse agreements among shareholders, which in this space are very often left behind or at least unclear, especially because the types of agreement we have available really vary depending on whether we're looking at a local field, a particular research project, at a national scale, a regional scale, or an international project. And this is made, of course, particularly complex by the fact that there is a lot of interest, particularly in heritage crops from the global south. And that means that we need to think very seriously about what are the challenges and opportunities and potential ethical questions emerging from the need to integrate data that come from across the globe and are produced under very different and varying conditions. So a key element, of course, of this environment are data infrastructures. These are key components and absolutely essential elements for trying to make sure that data get linked in a way that is accurate and that is reliable and is machine readable. And so there's been a very strong focus by many of the international organizations and the national organizations involved in this field on trying to develop global data infrastructures and, of course, related semantics, standards, and venues under which these standards and semantics can actually be discussed. And these are various characteristics. I've listed some of those on my slide. They have to be transdisciplinary, because not only we are looking at having data science and domain-specific expertise here, but you also need to have expertise about the different territories, the different legal systems involved, and the specific conditions under which data are being shared. They also, in that sense, need to be multi-stakeholder platforms involving what many organizations now in this field are calling communities of practice, which can involve, of course, experts in data science, but also, for instance, representatives of breeder communities, representatives of farmer communities, and representatives of potential consumers that can vary all the way from the food industry to the restoration industry and to everyday food consumers in different countries. This is also a system which, of course, needs to be deliberately transnational, and that is highly complex given that we have limited international regulations that are governing this sphere. There is a lot of work right now which I'm involved in, especially at the FAO and United Nations, trying to think about how can one update existing international regulations to include questions of data linkage, but we're still in the middle of thinking through what this may mean in practice. So there are underpinning governance challenges here, which are really substantive and absolutely intertwined with the technical specifications that we need to think about when deciding which standards to adopt and what counts as good data sources. And in that sense, there are several assumptions that are made in this field which are worth thinking about. One is this idea that what we're looking at when we're looking at plant data and data about crops are some global resource, which is in fact a common good that needs to be harnessed for the survival of humans and of the planet. This is a very important assumption and a commitment to put forward when one wants to use these kinds of data for climate mitigation. And at the same time, this is actually quite difficult to reconcile with, on the one hand, the rights of indigenous groups and local breeders who wish to retain some form of ownership over the data that they're producing. And on the other hand, the rights of the agrotech companies who are developing the vast majority of plant trials and plant-related research in this field, who also have a sense of ownership over this data and a sense of there needing to be very specific and detailed agreements around how the data may be used in the future. So on the one hand, in this field, we're seeing a strong emphasis on trying to push forward an open sharing of the data. There is a frequent appeal to the FAIR principles, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but constant issues around how these principles can be reconciled with maintenance of the rights of these different stakeholders. And the constant question that is asked, and crucial question to try and answer when confronting these challenges, is data governance of whom and established by whom in this space. So as one element to try and approach this question within our project, we have been trying to map the landscape of plant data linkage infrastructures and the ecosystem of this, which actually is a huge challenge because we're looking at hundreds of data initiatives, standards, and infrastructures, which are very highly distributed around the world, with a constant and regular variation in resolution and in the locations that we're looking at. So we can look at giant international collaborations involving very different institutions, but also at specific actors based within particular countries, which are also playing a very important role. And I think most importantly, most difficult to capture, this is a highly dynamic landscape. So it's very important not just to track these initiatives in terms of where they're based, which actually I think has been done very effectively by many of the initiatives already undergoing, but also to think about how they're evolving in time and track the temporal development of these initiatives as they're progressing. And so this is something that we're trying to do in this initiative called the Plant Database Map, which is very much a pilot project stage at the moment and includes an attempt to analyze and bring together an analysis of these resources, both in a quantitative sense, but also enriched by qualitative studies of the history of these data infrastructures and how they're developing and changing through time and in response to what. And this is really coming out of the recognition that what we're looking at here is a quintessentially socio-technical problem, a problem where it's impossible to separate technical aspects from their social context. And think, for instance, about a question that seems very obvious and obviously technical, which is the question about what counts as crop data production in this field. That seems pretty essential. I mean, where are data being produced here is an essential question. But in fact, answering the question of what counts as crop data production is not simple. Is it the result of growing plant specimen? Is it the result of actually selecting the strains that we want to cultivate in the field? So one step removed from actually growing the specimens. Is it still one step more removed? So is it the result of designing the field trials in the first place? Or is it a question of technology? Is it about who is developing measurement tools that are being used in this space and how? Or again, is it a question of how we are setting up data infrastructures? So is crop data production really to do with how we design and how we maintain data storage for this data? Now, each of these answers is legitimate in its own right as an answer to the question. But in fact, depending on which answer we adopt, there are then consequences for who is viewed as the legitimate owner of the data and who has control over the use of the data. And in fact, there is a persisting lack of clarity around these questions in this field. And this is one of the factors that leaves the door open for what many people called as a type of bioprospecting or digital feudalism, the idea that you can actually extract plant data from different territories and then import them typically in richer parts of the world where they can be exploited. And there's no clear sharing of benefits arising from this enterprise. And this is, of course, a very difficult challenge to confront, particularly given that we know the food system is built on centuries of exploitation that is very live around the world. And yet, at the same time, data science actually potentially provides very good avenues to try and confront this very challenge, specifically by recognizing that there are multiple answers to questions such as this. And this can be documented in the process of producing the data, processing the data, and reusing the data. So in that sense, environmental intelligence needs to include a high degree of social intelligence. And this is very important when setting up data infrastructures for climate mitigation, particularly in agriculture. So I would just point to a few key points that arise from the research we've been doing in this field. First of all, the idea that data stewardship is absolutely essential to fostering this kind of critically situated data reuse. And that means, of course, that relevant and significant investments need to be made, not just on the creation of data sets, but most importantly, on their processing and the ways in which they are caring for the data sets. And this involves also trying to create longer term strategies for this. One of the big obstacles we've seen in setting up these infrastructures is the fact that seldom there is a longer term vision for what is going on, because typically data infrastructures are funded for a very short amount of time. Secondly, we need to build responsible practice into technical specifications of data infrastructures. This is very important. There have been many mistakes made already in biomedicine around isolating ethical issues from technical questions about how one deals with the data. This clearly has not worked out very well for biomedicine, and in some cases it meant that ethical considerations became a sort of tick boxing exercise, while in fact what we want is to have appropriate reflection on a case-by-case basis on what the potential social challenges can be that relate to sharing the particular data sets coming from specific places. And so this is very important to integrate in data structures at the moment. It's actually being done. There is huge efforts from the CGR and from the UN to try and produce infrastructures that are doing precisely this. And this is, I think, a very exciting area in that sense. Thirdly, there needs to be a long-term involvement, not just of data scientists, the domain experts, but also data providers in the setup and the reuse of data within data infrastructures. And again, this has been done very effectively, fostered by organizations such as the Research Data Alliance and the CGR, again, who have created so-called communities of practice, where different stakeholders who have an interest in the data can meet and discuss the technical specifications for data reuse in a way that is also speaking to their own interest and their own needs, depending on where they're based in the world. Thirdly, and in a sense underpinning all of those, is the importance of keeping encouraging debate in this field over the goals and the concepts of human development that relate to data sharing in this area. So it's not just enough to say that we want climate mitigation here, but one needs to think carefully about what assumptions are being made around what constitutes human development and flourishing under conditions of climate mitigation, and which of the potential strategies that we have in front of us can work better in that respect. So this, of course, is also a discussion that we're having very much in relation to the post-COVID, or during COVID, I should say, situation at the moment. There's been a very spirited discussion of these issues in relation to reactions to the pandemic on the pages of the Harvard Data Science Review recently, which I'm pointing you to. This is an open access journal, so if you want to check it out, it's an interesting discussion, have a look at it. And I think it speaks to some of these lessons and applies them also more widely, including the realm of the biosciences. So thank you very much for the attention, and I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina. That was really fascinating. And can I just remind everyone, if you have any questions for Sabina, please do put them on Slido, and we'll return to them at the end after our next talk, which will be by Ruchi Chowdhury, who's going to give us a talk about a particularly interesting project in the area of digital twinning. So over to you, Ruchi.
Thanks, Sean. Yes. Good morning, everyone. And it seems that this is in some way a good continuity to Sabina's talk, because we go from the broad and the bigger picture of data management to an example of how we tackle it within a very specific environment. And I'm going to be talking about digital twins and digital twins going underground. What we are after is carbon reduction from the built environment in cities. And we all understand this is important because buildings are responsible for over 40% CO2 emissions. And we understand that any reduction will involve scaling up of standard measures that we all understand and accept for energy efficiency. So while that's one problem of scaling up an effort, which is by now well understood, I think what we also at the same time need to do is go beyond them. We need to go beyond the standard measures. And in particular, we need to look into cities to find creative solutions that synergistically exploit waste resources across cities. And this is exactly what we've been looking at within the data-centric engineering program within our group. So we accept that digital twins, which represent a kind of very good confluence of data and science for co-learning, can be transformational in reducing the carbon footprint of built environments, because they can enable us to get the extra squeeze and operate the built environment really efficiently. But what I would want to demonstrate in this talk is that digital twins as a paradigm are particularly well suited for scaling up new and untapped potential across cities, i.e. they become really important and in fact necessary when we are looking at non-standard solutions. And a non-standard solution that I'm going to demonstrate to you is an underground farm. This is a farm that's built in air raid shelters that were built in the 40s during World War II. They are 33 meters below ground, and roughly, for those of you who know London well, between North and South Clapham stations. And there's an underground farm here which grows, microgreens. And they use two parallel tunnels, approximately 400 meter in length, and they're using approximately 700 square meters of growing area within these tunnels. Now, traditionally, controlled agriculture such as this occurs in glass houses or greenhouses. And there they do not need artificial lighting, but they can have really state-of-the-art modern ventilation and heating controls. They can also inject artificial CO2. This poses different kind of challenges. It's a repurposed derelict space, which, in a tunnel, and they're relying entirely on artificial light that are optimized for photosynthesis to grow the plants. And this is a commercial farm. But yet, unlike other commercial farms, it's relying on ventilation shafts that were built in the 1940s. And despite the fact that it has the advantage of a very stable environment of surrounding ground, so soil, it's unheated. So, which we want it to be unheated. We want it to be sustained within the temperature ranges without artificial heating. So the challenge that we took on many years ago was how to fine-tune the system and make it use minimal resources. And to do so, we want to go from the real farm to its full dynamic digital twin that takes data from the farm and gives feedback on operating it efficiently. And for that, we've made a long journey, but one of the key outcomes has been this cloud-based application that we call Crop, which utilizes the flexibility, the customization, and evolution of what a cloud-based system can provide to bring the data together. And as Sabina mentioned, in this case also we are dealing with very, very heterogeneous data streams, from qualitative data to high time resolution data, but also indirect data, where we have to infer what we are after based on indirect observations. So what this implies is the Crop is based, the foundation is a framework of digital twin, where you have observations, you have a system for data curation and data processing, and of course, most importantly, you have the outputs which need to be useful. And that's basically the underpinning idea behind a digital twin, that at the bottom line, it needs to be useful and it needs to provide feedback to the real system. And that's always been at the forefront of designing the system. So a little bit about the observations first, in tune with Sabina's talk earlier on, what it meant to get the live data. And the challenge here was not just taking observations 33 meters below ground, which has problems, technical problems of signals and wires, etc. But also it's a fully operational farm, which means that, you know, we place sensors all over the place. We find awkward places in which we need to install our sensors, and we manage as best as we can. And we've seen the sensors evolve over the years as we've been working towards them. So we monitor temperatures, we monitor relative humidity, carbon dioxide levels inside the farm. We also have cameras to measure the state of the crops as they grow. And we also have air velocity sensors down the tunnel. And all of these are then curated in a platform, which we are calling Crop, as I mentioned. And that's basically the data processing module. And so that's one of the big pieces within the Crop architecture, in addition to user interfaces, which are designed for multiple users, i.e. the researchers who might want to use this information to improve our understanding of the models or the processes underlying the farm, but also the end user, which is the growers themselves, who now have been trained to check on what the digital twin is telling them to do at the beginning and at the end of the working day in the farm. And that's kind of what the database looks like, which involves multiple streams, many of which actually need to be input manually by the farm operators at the end of the day for factors such as crop yield, for example. Okay, so now to the final part, which is what it gets used for, all this information, and how it gets assimilated and turned transformation of data into information that is usable. So there, one of the key things that we find is that there are three factors that are very important for the farm for growing their crops. The first is temperature, and there's a limiting range within which the crops will thrive, beyond which, if the temperatures are too high, they will not, that will not be optimum. If they are too low, they will not grow optimally either. Relative humidity, also, yes, there's a threshold at which it starts, but then within that, the lower the humidity, the better these microgreens are growing. And of course, something similar for the light, that more the light, the more the plants will photosynthesize, if it's at the right spectrum. Okay, so, and basically the light being the most important factor. So what the confluence of all this data coming in does is that it gives us various bits of pieces which we can compile and modelize. Or so here we use a dynamic linear model to understand that, okay, light is the most the critical factor, but so is the external temperature. But the two are confounding in ways so that the temperature changes are irregular and they occur daily in a variable manner in terms of the difference between the average external temperature in the day, but also how the lights are being turned on and on. So if the temperatures are at the higher range, the lights will have a different effect on the internal temperature of the farm versus if the temperature on the lower range, because there are other factors that come into play. And so being able to model that enables us to then predict the temperatures 24 hours ahead and be able to tell the farm owners what might go wrong or what action they might need to take. For example, if they need to turn on their ventilation to higher levels or they need to decrease the humidity levels, we can give them warning about the farm. So we've created such a warning system based on predictions. So based on indirect observations of the lights and the external temperatures, we can forecast a day ahead, and we can match that to the operational controls. For example, in the first part, you see that we underpredict the temperatures, and we can tell that something happened with the lights there, that we can immediately flag that, check if your lights were on within normal regimes. And similarly, on another day, we see everything going very well, predictably, and yes, okay, everything's going on well, nothing to worry about, stay as you are. And another day, we find that the temperature was constant rather than having the strong seasonal diurnal component, and that makes the temperatures a little bit higher than what we expected, but not too much. So we can accordingly flag warnings. And on another day, we can show that the temperature decreased. So they may need to be very careful. They may need to put some auxiliary heating to make sure that the yields stay as they are. So, and in some cases, when the things are going well, we might even tell them that, look, you might expect to harvest a day earlier. So you will increase your yield if you go in this manner. So we always have to give them also one step ahead, that what does it mean for the temperatures to be optimal, that, you know, it cuts down their growing time and hence can have their overall yield increase by a certain percentage. But in addition to that, the digital twin is enabling us to do something else. We also rely on our physics-based model of photosynthesis and how plants exchange heat and mass with their environment. And that enables us to understand different scenarios, that what if we were to increase the density of the plants within the same tunnels, or if we were to expand to a cooler tunnel. So we can simulate scenarios that are not existing beyond what the data is able to provide us if we have a good physics-based model. Another factor where it helps us is that with the data, we can tune the model or calibrate the model better to the farm and its environment, and thereby understand what exactly is going on in the farm. So normally in any kind of built environment, if I had to model a building, I would assume a constant ventilation rate and airspeed. And we know in reality that's not true. But having that kind of rich data enables us to track the change in ventilation rate, which I'm showing in the second plot, and the internal airspeed, and then say, oh, based on these two combinations, you are exceeding your optimal temperature. But then we can use that to model a scenario that what if you increase your ventilation, would you be able to bring the temperatures down? And this shows that yes, if they increase the ventilation to 10 times of air changes per hour, they would be able to bring down temperatures to manageable range. So all this work that spans across data generation, data curation, data processing, modelization, of course, has needed the efforts of a diverse team. And a lot of it has been enabled by PhD student Melanie Janseng and Rebecca Ward, who've been working on it since the get-go. But coming at Turing really accelerated the work on the digital twin, thanks to research software engineering team and also some of the postdocs in data science at Turing. So with that, I will end my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. That was absolutely fascinating. We've now got a stream of questions coming in, so thanks everyone for posting those. I'll run through a few for Sabina first. So the first one is asking about indigenous groups, local breeders and farmers. To what extent are their views being represented in this conversation about global strategy?
Thank you very much. Of course, that's a key question, I think, in this space. And there are the big splits are the fact that, of course, for a long time, we've had a discussion developing on data standards in the technical community on one hand. And this was very much separate from these discussions happening in relation to the rights of indigenous groups and local breeders. And also, of course, there is typically a big power differential between researchers based in institutions like the Turing, who are doing very high level cutting edge work around the world, typically in the global north on this, and local farmers which are based in different parts of the world and really don't have the visibility of the power to make their voices heard. I think the key issue and the interesting potential novelty here is to try and really bring these problems together by tackling the technical specifications together. And so one of the aspects I've been focusing on is the standards for the semantics around the data, because these are typically where we see clashes really in the technical sense around what constitutes the best plant trait. Does it matter, for instance, that we have a description of the inside of the cassava root, right? How soft it is or what color it is. From a purely biological taxonomical perspective, these are meaningless descriptions. We don't really want them in our data set. Nobody cares among the plant scientists typically about this, but for local communities, these are key considerations because they have everything to do with the marketability of the product, with how people actually try out whether a particular root is better or worse than another, how they're cooked, etc., etc. So there are initiatives like the crop ontology, which I've been collaborating with now for a few years, which are initiatives where you have data scientists and domain experts getting together on a regular basis with representatives of local breeders and farmers. And this is very much typically coordinated through the CGIAR in their different institutes around the global south. And this is an attempt to indeed bring the stakeholders together and have a meaningful conversation that is not in an abstract sense about the rights of indigenous communities in general, but very specifically about, okay, so if this is a situation, how would you modify the keywords we are using to describe our data and the categories we're using to classify them for our AI systems in a way that reflects some of your needs and your worries? And yeah, and I think typically this can then span across the many different standards that we're using to do this kind of work. And the more of this happens, I think the more we'll be able to start tackling this. So I think the question is not so much voicing indigenous right in a kind of more general sense. There are many venues for that, but it's making sure that they intersect at the technical level with what's going on in terms of developing data infrastructures.
Thank you. And then a follow-up question is about to the extent to which we can capture what's called the art of the grower. So I take this to mean that not all farms are the same and not all farmers are the same. It's not an exact science and they have to adapt to their current situation or following particular traditions. So to what extent can we capture the fact that farmers are really left to work in their own bespoke manner?
Yeah, that's, again, a fascinating question. And again, focusing on the semantics can help a lot, because this is a field where many measurements are actually almost quintessentially imprecise, right? They're qualitative measurements around, how long the stem of a plant is. Well, it depends on where you cut the stem, right? I mean, very simple things like that. But once you scale up the potential differences between how different farmers would cut the stem or different breeders would cut the stem, then you potentially can see big differences or big fluctuations in the data you have about the length of a stem, right? So I think, first of all, there are methods being developed, especially in relation to the biontologies here, to try and standardize these measurements better. And when that's not possible, to describe how the measurement has been achieved locally, so that we can then retrack and compare the different methods that were used to obtain that measurement. And that, of course, adds complexity to data science, but at least it makes it possible to disaggregate the data and really interrogate how they've been produced, which I think is really core necessity for many of these kinds of considerations. And I think another thing that's really important here is the idea of actually really thinking through what the assumptions are about the ultimate goals of agriculture that we are using here. And because there are clashes that I think they're often underemphasized in technical discussions, but clashes, for instance, around whether high yield is really the one and only purpose of thinking about agricultural development. And I think unless we tackle that discussion, it's very difficult to then have a proper dialogue around the art of the grower, because for many smallhold farmers, the potential, the interest is not necessarily to have a high yield crop, but it is to have a crop which is more sustainable given the environment that they have, more capable of resisting certain kinds of diseases, and more capable of feeding the community around them. So I think these things can be reconciled, but very important to bring these considerations that may look so qualitative and context-based straight back into how we're thinking and setting up a data science in this domain, I think.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question for you for now, Sabina. What influence can the UK actually have in what is really a very global and not a very well controlled situation?
Well, I think the UK has incredible data science, actually, and crop science, and it has a long tradition of setting standards and having a huge influence worldwide on how we think about agricultural development, how we select stock, how we maintain seed banks, for instance. I mean, we have some of the most important institutes in agricultural development in the world are based in the UK. So the potential, and in fact, the actual influence of the UK in many of these issues is extensive. At the same time, I think it's always particularly now very important that the UK continues to engage in international discussions on this field, because the counter side to this is the idea that then, because we have such powerhouses nationally, then that may mean that we can just do a lot of this work in-house, and we don't particularly need to work with other stakeholders around the world. And this would be, of course, a gigantic mistake, partly because, of course, these systems are all interconnected at the planetary level, so there's no point thinking about this on a purely national level. And secondly, because many of the important steps forward in standardization of data work are actually happening abroad at the European level and at the global level through initiatives like the CGR. UK stakeholders are involved in this, but it certainly is an international discussion. So I think it goes two ways. The UK is very well positioned to have a strong influence on these debates, but it needs to take them seriously.
Okay, thank you very much. And we now have a few questions for Ruchi. So firstly, there's a couple of kind of technical questions about the particular system you described. Can you say a bit more about the temporal or historical data that you have? Presumably this, I don't know how long this farm's been going and how much data you've actually got. So that's one question. And secondly, is this a single crop that's being grown here?
So the answer to the first question is that yes, depends on the variables, but for most of the environmental variables, we get data by hours or minutes, but we don't need to define, actually, we define what we want to extract based on what we are trying to infer. So for example, in the feedback model that I showed, which was for immediate forecasting, you do need immediate historical data. So you want to have the past 2 or 3 days, but the whole model is trained on a much longer time span of data. Similarly, for the other model, which is for scenario assessment, where we need data to first calibrate the model and infer parameters, what matters is to have relevant data points, which is data that has information. So then actually 2 points in the day become more pertinent, which is the conditions when lights were on and conditions when lights were off. So it's highly variable, but the system is flexible enough that we can extract information based on the time horizon and the time span and the time step that we need. If that answers the question. And the second was about the yield. Yes, the crop types. So we are lucky that, I mean, in the sense, it makes sense that the common thing across the crops is that they're all microgreens. That means the leaf area index doesn't vary that much across all of them, but also the growing time. There's not a huge variation in the growing time per crop. They are all within the same ballpark. What does vary is the kind of temperatures each of the different crops like. So across the microgreens, there are variations like pea shoots, lots of pea shoots, wasabi, broccoli, mustard, and some others that I may be forgetting, but there are about 6-7 varieties of them. And some of them like to be in slightly colder areas. And that's one of the things that, in fact, one of the things we discovered through early monitoring along the tunnel, spatially, that areas that were cooler in the tunnel, which were the back of the tunnel, tend to be better for certain kind of crops, whereas others, it didn't matter, they were more robust, whereas others preferred to be in the warmer regions. So we accordingly, in fact, advised the farm operators to be more strategic about where they were placing the trays. So, yeah.
Thank you. And then a couple of questions actually about the whole underground farming business, I suppose. What's the main motivation for developing these? I mean, does it actually produce crops that taste better or just much cheaper to produce? And does this happen in other kind of underground situations, like in old coal mines, for example?
So this is the example that we know of in the UK, but I have seen in the news another underground farm around metro areas in Korea. But the thing that motivated the founders of this organization called Growing Underground was that there was a derelict space. They saw an opportunity of using a derelict space to some creative use that would also enhance the urban environment overall. And us as a group, we are interested in urban integrated farming because we believe that there is enough waste streams in a city in terms of CO2 and heat, which can be used to produce food closer to where we consume it. But more importantly, we believe that it brings other benefits other than environmental benefits, so psychological, sociological benefits to a city in terms of having foods. And in fact, we are looking at examples of buildings that do generate a lot of waste heat and CO2. So there would be hospitals, data centers, or school buildings where you have many pupils in a classroom. All of these are examples where you could integrate them with urban farms where you would be using waste streams. Now, it's not coming from a vacuum, because the closest analogy to this is the notion of plant factories. And this is quite a well-established domain of work, which is enclosed boxed environments like warehouses where you're producing many plants with artificial light. And that would be the closest to what they are doing here.
Okay, thank you. And how viable would it be to create a similar digital twin for a traditional open air farm, given that that's a much less controlled environment?
There would be other kind of challenges. So we've entirely focused on control environment agriculture until now. We haven't considered. There would be other complexities. I think we would have to. It wouldn't be a matter of simply transferring what we've done for this digital twin to an outdoor environment. I suspect that it would have other challenges.
If I may actually interject on this, Ruchi, I think it's a fascinating question. And there are already experimental stations around the UK and so-called farm platforms where they're attempting something similar, but for open air farming, which of course is enormously complex. So they don't create models anywhere near as advanced as the ones that you presented. But I think they have an incredible collection of data that is now being put together and started to be analyzed. So for instance, we have one here in Devon, where I'm based, near Exeter. There is the one that Rothamsted is managing in North Weeks. And so maybe like that could be a very interesting thing potentially to think about for your project to intersect with some of those to see whether there are interesting questions around importing or exporting models.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, because there are many commonalities about the challenges with the kind of data we are trying to collect. For example, we've been struggling a lot with estimating crop yield and crop health, which, as you said, is a very inexact and science and very difficult to measure.
Yeah, understandably, yeah.
Great. And then I've one more question for both of you. Would it be possible to also incorporate information data about consumer behavior and preference? We've talked mostly about production here, but of course, would consumers eat just plant-based products in the future is going to be a challenging question. If consumers don't like the stuff that's being produced, of course they won't buy it and eat it.
I guess, I mean, I could just very briefly say that there is a big effort already undergoing at the international level to try and integrate this data into data that are more about agricultural production. So within the CJR and also the Resource Data Alliance, there are communities of practice that are looking specifically at socioeconomic data of relevance to agricultural development, and ways in which we can think about a semantics and a data organization system that allows us to integrate those data indeed into more technical specifications. And I mean, I find that absolutely, you know, I think that's actually the frontier for much of this work, because this means that you have to tackle the complexity of thinking about the social context in which the plants are actually consumed. And you know, again, I think some of the standards provide an interesting way in, precisely because, you know, then the idea of what constitutes a plant trait becomes something that you can look at from a variety of perspectives, but digital tools actually allow you to incorporate those perspectives into the same system, potentially at least. So there is an opening, I think, that digitalization can give to this. Of course, there are much bigger questions around who is then being represented in these data sets, which other people have discussed yesterday also in AIUK, which then become, I mean, come to the fore of this domain. But again, given that I think they're already there, recognizing that these are very big questions is not going to be a bad thing.
Okay, actually, one last question has just come in for Ruchi. Is there potential to grow plants on treated sewage in sewers without sending the sewage miles out of town?
Well, that question is posed to me, but I must say that I would not be best placed to answer this. Probably a plant scientist, and we do collaborate with them. So we are not growers. We simply look to optimize or fine-tune the environment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Sabina and Ruchi, for some fascinating talks, and to everyone for contributing to the questions and discussion at the end. We're about out of time now, so thanks everyone for getting involved in this session. I think it's been really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.